Good afternoon. Hopefully everyone had a good lunch and you're ready to learn about branch office virtualization. My name is Robert Larson. I'm an architect with Microsoft Consulting Services out of the US, and I'm here to talk about this subject. Hopefully this is something you'll find interesting and will actually be applicable to your environment. What are the session prerequisites? Basically, looking for, if you're here, you have an interest in virtualization, you have branch offices that you're looking to virtualize or consolidate the services that are running in those branches. Kind of the prerequisites from an information perspective, knowledge. Assume that you have branch offices, you know what the challenges are. We'll review some of those just to make sure that there's maybe something that you don't experience, maybe someone else does. And I'm assuming that everyone that's here has some level of knowledge around virtualization. This session is not to teach you what virtualization is. We will be talking about processes associated to virtualization, the tools that you can use to actually accomplish branch office virtualization, but I'm assuming you know what a virtual machine is, you know what a virtual network is, you know the basics, you have all of that. We look at what we're trying to accomplish in the session is understanding how Microsoft can provide you a set of solutions to help you virtualize the branch office, maybe what's some guidance that can help you accomplish that, and then also what is the process that you should undertake to actually virtualize your branch office. We're going to do that by going over some challenges. We're going to discuss the products that Microsoft has released that are available today for you to go off and accomplish this goal. We're going to go through a step-by-step process of actually doing the virtualization. I'm going to give some demos. I'm going to demo some of the products. I'm going to demo how to actually accomplish some of the steps as we're going through the step-by-step process. And then at the end, if you're still here, I'm going to give away 4 things. So if you're interested in that, stick around, and hopefully you'll enjoy the session. So let's talk about branch office. So these are the typical topologies that are out there. There's one or more hubs, there's one or more branches out there, and there are different approaches to actually providing services in the branch. There's the approach where you have no services in the branch at all. All that are there are desktop PCs and end users. So how many people have that kind of scenario in their environment today? Raise your hand, please. Okay. So then you have the approach where you apply core services out there. You put DNS, you put DHCP, maybe you put DCs out there, maybe you provide services like file and print, maybe some line of business applications that you can't seem to put in the central and get the good communications based on your WAN speed. So how many feel they're in that kind of approach in their environment? So that's pretty good. And then the last one is the situation where if you have a WAN outage, you can't be down. So you put all of the services that you require for that branch to be up. And branch in this term may also be things like a retail location, and that's typically where this scenario falls into play. I have a retail location where I have to be up and running, serving business. I have to be able to do the day-to-day business of that site. So how many of you have that type of situation in your environment? Okay, not very many people. So that's kind of what I expected. So if you actually look at, these are the challenges you are probably living. You have WAN issues. You have management issues. You have provisioning and deployment issues. You know, all of the things are on this list. I won't go over it. You know it. You live it today. I'm not here to tell you what your challenges are because you can probably add things to this list that I don't have up here. But what you may not know is where virtualization can help you solve some of those issues. And I'll talk about these, and I'd be interested if anyone could bring up some additional ones as I'm going through of a challenge where you think virtualization could help. So WAN performance, virtualization isn't going to make your WAN any faster or any slower. I can affect what amount of traffic is going across the WAN. So I was on the edge about whether or not I wanted to put that one in the camp, so I left it out for now. Provisioning services, new servers, putting applications out there, virtualization can definitely help you in that scenario. If I've put a virtualized system out in the branch and I have it properly managed and I have it properly configured, I can provision a server from the hub data center quickly and easily, and depending on how I approach it, I can actually build a library of virtual machines that may either have a pre-built scenario on them from an application standpoint, or may have an automated approach, so it has a base operating system and then everything else is scripted from there. From a management headache perspective, virtualization can provide you a simplified view into the remote environment by utilizing the right type of management solution for virtualization, which we'll talk about. Virtualizing your servers really isn't going to solve the remote user support issue. User experience, depending on how and what services you provide in the branch, you can make the user experience better. If your issue today is down at the bottom, the space and cost issue, where you can't put any more services in the branch because it's too expensive to do it, if you virtualize, you now open up the ability to maybe deploy additional services in that branch and therefore provide a better user experience, maybe a faster user experience. From a data security perspective, this is one of those things I'm pretty sure there'll be, if we took it off to the side, there'd be a lot of interesting conversations about. Some people say virtualization is actually decreases data security. Some people say it increases data security. From a Microsoft perspective, if you combine the right technologies together, especially newer technologies that are coming in Windows Server 2008, like BitLocker, encryption on the disk, stuff like that, you can actually increase data security. You can do this on a physical server too, but in the scenario, I can ensure that if I virtualize a server, even though that virtual server is kind of mobile, I can ensure that if someone does steal it, they're not stealing anything that they can actually go off and look at. So if you look at Microsoft solutions to help you in the branch office environment, if you look at the server side of the picture, the virtualization technology today for the branch office would be Virtual Server 2005 R2 SP1. That's going to give you the underlying virtualization technology. To manage that, you would layer System Center Virtual Machine Manager on it. Gives you a centralized management platform. I can manage, like 400 hosts and a lot more, over 1,000 virtual machines. I forget the actual numbers right now. Then you have Operations Manager, which allows you to monitor that environment. So I can now remotely monitor that Operations Manager with the server virtualization management pack. Lets me see the server view of that branch as well as the virtual machine view. So I can see the host, and I can see all the virtual machines on that host. I can get utilization information at both levels. Data Protection Manager is all about, now that I've virtualized that environment, I need to be able to provide backup. I've got to provide disaster recovery. I have to do that in an efficient manner. I'm curious, how many of you have branch offices where you do all backup local to the branch versus centralizing it? Okay, so everyone does backup. So the opposite, how many people centralize their backups of their branch? That was actually about evenly split. So Data Protection Manager has a lot of WAN optimization technologies in it that minimize the amount of impact to your WAN when you do the backup across the WAN. So it's a good solution if you're doing backup to a centralized environment it can do the backup of the branch office in a quick and easy manner. And we'll talk about that more. If you look at the other side of virtualization, so most everyone talks about the server side of virtualization, but if you look at the desktop side of virtualization, you can also get some optimization in your environment. So let's say virtual PC would be used where you have a legacy application, you don't have the ability to get off of that legacy application anytime soon, and you want to be able to provide that functionality to your branch users, and you want to be able to do it in an easy manner. So that would be what you would use there. Terminal services would be, I have a line of business application centrally distributed in my hub data centers. I can't cost effectively, or the application just won't let me distribute it to the branches. So I want to provide the best user experience I can to the end user, but keep it centralized, be able to manage it centrally. So terminal services, using what we term the presentation virtualization, I can now put an icon on the desktop. The user doesn't know really that the application's not on their desktop. They double click it just like they normally would. They run the application remotely from the hub data center. SoftGrid is all about minimizing the amount of deployment or applications that are running locally on your desktops, and also providing application compatibility between multiple applications that may conflict with each other, or multiple versions of an application. So let's say you're in the process and you're migrating from one version of a line of business app to the next version of a line of business app. You want to run both of them on the client, but they won't install together on the same machine. The one way to do that is to use SoftGrid to accomplish that. Configuration Manager actually falls into the server and the desktop camp. I put it on this slide because it fit. It's all about the asset management software deployment, actually getting patches to the end users and to the servers. Config Manager understands the relationship between a virtualized host and the virtual machines running on that host. And when you schedule patches to be deployed, it'll basically do that in a controlled fashion, and it will tell you where there's conflicts. So let's look at if I took all of those technologies and I actually wanted to deploy them, and I'm going to focus the discussion from kind of now on the server side, just due to time constraints. If I wanted to look at the core services that I would deploy to get the main functionality of, I want to virtualize the server in the branch, I want to be able to manage it, I want to be able to monitor it, I want to be able to back it up. The way I would deploy that is I would put Virtual Machine Manager, Data Protection Manager, and Operations Manager and Configuration Manager hosted in the data center. And then out in the branch office, I would deploy Virtual Server, and then I would deploy all of the agents for those other applications on there so that I could remotely manage that box. That's going to get me the core functionality that I'm going to want in almost every branch office deployment. If I want to extend that design where maybe I'm looking at, I have a larger branch office, or I have a branch office where I need the more advanced functionalities, then I may want to extend the design by adding additional functionalities. So let's say now I'm deploying bigger boxes out in the branch. I'm deploying Exchange. I'm deploying SharePoint. Maybe I want to provide local internet access out there, and I want to do all of this in that branch office. Now I can do that. I can virtualize all of that, and I can also do that in such a way to provide more services locally. So what's it going to take in order to get to that optimal branch office configuration? You have two issues to deal with. You have the issue of, I need to optimize the services that I'm offering in the branch. And then there's the issue of, how do I actually virtualize those services in the branch? Optimizing the services in the branch is well documented, and it's been out there for a while. The branch office infrastructure solution. This is a downloadable set of guidance that's on the Microsoft website that takes you through a very structured approach to optimizing the services that you want to offer in the branch, helping you make the decisions what services you want to offer in the branch and what's the best way to deploy those services to address those challenges that we talked about in the slide, the WAN performance, the manageability, the cost, and everything. The way that the document is structured, it talks about what the branch architecture should be. It talks about what the core branch design should be. So what are the core services you typically would go deploy in that branch environment? And then it talks about if I want to extend or I'm looking to add additional services, how do I integrate those in that design? That documentation is out there, it's well documented. I didn't really want to cover that in this session, but what I did want to cover was how do I actually now go, I've gone through the process of the branch office infrastructure solution. I've decided these are the services that I want to deploy. The one thing that the branch office, the boys is the easiest way to say that, what it does not do is tell you how to do that in a virtualized manner. All it does is tell you these are the services you should or should not put in the branch and why, and here's your logical flow diagram of how to go off and do that. So let's actually talk about what kind of the process you should go through from a branch office virtualization. I will say in the deck that you can download off of the conference site is all of the information I'm going to go through here, but there's an appendix to the deck that actually has a step-by-step kind of project approach of how you should go about in doing a virtualization project, how you should go out, how you should discover your environment, how you should analyze the services you already have in your branches from a virtualization perspective. How do you determine something is a candidate for virtualization, something that's not a candidate for virtualization? How do you go off, set up the test environment? How do you do a pilot? All of those typical project type of approaches. I figured that would be something you wouldn't want to go through in this session because it's not that interesting and it doesn't lend very well to doing demos. So, and I figured you probably wanted to see a demo of the products. So we're going to focus on the actual the process associated to doing the virtualization, and we're going to integrate demos to show you how to do some of this in the process. So we're going to start with this scenario. We're going to say that in our scenario data center, we have some basic services out there. In our branch offices, we have some basic services out there. This is more of the middle of the road core design, which typically most people use. Once we start here, we're going to layer things on top of it and kind of give you the approach to go through this. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to add your virtualization core services. So that involves typically you're going to have to install some new servers. You're going to have to add, the first thing you're going to want to add to your infrastructure is Virtual Machine Manager. That's going to give you the basis to manage your data center environment and your branch office environment from all your virtualization host standpoint. Then you typically want to install Data Protection Manager in that environment so that you provide the backup services. And then if you don't have Operations Manager, most people have this or something else similar to it, you need a monitoring solution. Once you have all of that installed in the environment, that gives you your basis in order to actually start building out your branch environment. So in this scenario, you're really talking about, now I need to deploy a virtual host to a branch. So I've done all the analysis. I've done all of the project steps that you should go through to figure out which is the branch I should start with, what's the low-hanging fruit that I want to attack first. It's the typical stuff you would go through All of that is kind of between, it happens like during step 1 or between step 1 and step 2. What you need out there in the branch is a Windows Server 2003 best to do R2 host, Service Pack 2, and Windows Remote Management 1.1. Virtual Machine Manager needs Windows Remote Management 1.1, which is kind of a remote command execution environment that we've come out with in order to do all of its work. Now, I don't have to go and install this host in the branch. I can install this host in the data center. I can configure it, I can build it, I can actually deploy, I can build a set of templatized virtual machines, I can deploy all of that to this host, and then I can move it to the branch. Once I get it to the branch, or I can even do this step in the data center, I want to add this virtual machine host to VMM so we can manage it. Typically, you can, Virtual Machine Manager will actually deploy virtual server to the box. So as part of the build process for the host, all I have to do is install the operating system in patches, all the hot fixes that I want to install, that you install in your environment, and then Windows Remote Management, and then at that point VMM, the box has to be a member of a domain or a trusted domain, and as long as it's in that configuration, I can actually, at that point, never look at the box again. Because I can now tell Virtual Machine Manager, I want to add this as a managed host. Add it to my pool of servers to manage. It will go deploy virtual server to the box. It will deploy all the other components it needs, which is basically an XML component and the agent, and it will automatically add it to the environment to be managed. Once I get it configured, then I want to deploy the agents for the other services I want to use. So in our scenario, the DPM agent and the Ops Manager agent. The assumption is that when you've installed Ops Manager, you've integrated Ops Manager with Virtual Machine Manager. So the process there, there's a couple of steps that you actually have to do to go through and integrate those together so that as I monitor both the host and the virtual machines, I will be able to get that information in the reports in Ops Manager, and then there's an integration with Virtual Machine Manager is I can get the same reports in Virtual Machine Manager that I can get in Ops Manager. So I can use Virtual Machine Manager as my single window to manage my environment. Once I've actually got that host out there, I've got it configured, I've got it managed, I've been able to watch that from a WAN perspective. I can see it, I can see the utilization going on it. I'm comfortable with that it's ready to host something. Then the next step is to actually, if I have systems out there in the branch, and I'm assuming that's what we're talking about because there's a lot of people that raise their hands. If I have systems out there in the branch, now I need to get them from their physical servers to virtual machines. That process I can actually do sitting in the data center. I don't have to go to the branch to do that with Virtual Machine Manager. I can do it in a step-by-step approach. I can move one machine at a time. Which machine that you move first. Typically, you can take the approach of saying, I either want to move my DC first, that if I have a DC in the branch, or I want to move it last. But you typically want to make sure that the service is available in both scenarios as I'm moving things, because I need to have authentication services in the process. So once I move all of those machines, now I'm down to one box in the branch office, and now things change a little bit. Now I have to worry about, I have a single point of failure in the branch, I have to make sure that I'm monitoring it, I'm backing it up, I'm managing it appropriately. I have to be concerned about who needs management access. There's a lot of process-related things that I have to deal with. But before we go there, let me actually show you a demo of a P2V. How many of you have seen Virtual Machine Manager before? So some of you have. How many of you actually have done a P2V before? So about 10 of you. So let's switch over. Okay, so let's talk about what's my demo environment look like. I'm actually demoing on a box that's running Windows 2008, the Hyper-V, our new name for it. It's still hard for me to get used to that. It's a full install of Windows Server 2008, and in there I'm running multiple virtual machines. I'm running a 64-bit version of a DC. I'm running a 64-bit version of Virtual Machine Manager. I have a virtual machine I'm using as my physical machine to actually do the demo, just minimize the number of boxes I have to deal with. And then I actually have Virtual Server 2005 R2 SP1 in a Hyper-V virtual machine, and I can do deployments to that box. But due to timing, we switched to using a physical box because it takes longer to do it in one machine. So what we're actually going to do is I'm going to walk through the process of what I would do in a branch. In the branch, I have a physical box that I want to turn that into a virtual machine. If I'm doing this from the data center and that physical box is running Windows 2003, I can use VSS, the snapshotting service, in order to do a live migration of that box. So I don't have to go turn the box off, boot into something else, and then migrate the machine. I can actually sit in the data center, I can pick the box, I can tell it to migrate, and it goes and happens. When I do that, no traffic from the actual migration of the physical server to the virtual machine goes across my WAN. If that operating system is Windows 2000, Windows 2000 doesn't have VSS as a component. So the process is, from the data center, I deploy Windows PE to that box. I boot from Windows PE, and then I do the migration, and all the migration happens in the local environment. So in a P2V migration from the data center, the only impact to my WAN is going to be the process of copying that WinPE image to the remote location. And I would have to do that for every migration that I do, so you have to take that into account. I wanted to say that as we go through. So to actually do a physical to virtual migration, it's pretty simple. You come over to, this is Virtual Machine Manager, this is the administrative console. You go over to the Actions menu and say, I want to convert a physical server. And I think I clicked on that. There we go. It comes up with the wizard, and it asks you, what is the computer name that I want to convert? So in this, I just called the name physical. You need to provide credentials that you're going to use. So these are the credentials that Virtual Machine Manager is going to use to get access to that remote box in order to do local communication and tell it to go do the snapshot, actually go do the migration and everything. So it's going to deploy some information to that server in order to gather information about the box. Might as well click to that. And then it's going to allow me to actually do the migration. So I have the option of saying, what do I want to name the virtual machine when I do the migration? Maybe I don't want to call it the same thing in the admin. A lot of people say they do want to call it the same thing, so you leave it alone. And you can set the owner. By default, it's whatever you're logged in with. You can set it to something else. As an example, I'll set it to self-test for the next demo. At this point, it's basically saying, I want to go communicate with that remote server that I know nothing about, and I want to go gather information about that box. So I'm going to go learn about what's the hardware installed on there, what's the software installed on there. I'm going to look for known issues that would prevent me to be able to migrate this box using the VSS snapshotting approach or the WinPE approach. So it's going off. There's a bunch of rules in the background that it's going to use. It's going to gather information. That information is going to be sent back to the host. It's going to process that. It's going to look for things that it can't migrate, and it's going to come back and it's going to give me a report to that effect. It'll give me some basic system information here in the GUI. It'll tell me what the operating system is, what the hard drives are that are on the system, what type of networking adapter. So this is a 2003 Service Pack 2 box. It's got 127 gig disk and drive C, and it's got one network connection in it. So I click Next. And this is where the engine has gone off and done the analysis, and it's coming back and it's telling me right now there are no issues detected on the migration of this physical machine. If there were issues, it would detail where the issue is, whether it's hardware or software, if it knows what the possible resolution is to that, it will tell you what the resolution is and give you guidance on how to resolve the problems in order to allow the migration to occur. Once I've gone off and I've solved those problems, I can click this Check Again box. It'll go reanalyze the machine and say, have I resolved all of those issues? If I have, then it will actually let me proceed through the migration. So I click Next. This is where I have the ability, it'll list all the disks. It'll let me make a decision on what I want to do with those disks. Do I want to change the size of the virtual hard drive? Do I want to change the type of the virtual hard drive to dynamic or fixed? Do I want to change the channel the virtual hard drive is connected to? Do I want to leave it on the IDE channel, which is the default, or do I want to move it to a SCSI channel? Maybe it already was SCSI, and if it was, it would have brought that up as that being the default. I just click Next, and then it provides me what we call the intelligent placement wizard that has gone off and analyzed all the hosts that are available in my server pool that VMM manages. And it's come back and it's told me this is the best host based on the current picture of that host, based on disk space, processor utilization, memory utilization, network utilization. What is the best host to use? And in my demo, it was pretty simple because there's one host to pick. So I picked that host. It also gives some more information down here about the host. Tells me if there's any issues from a ratings perspective. If I had a SAN on that host, it would tell me whether or not the SAN was available for use during the migration. VMM actually allows you, if you have, in this scenario, because we're doing branches, it's not going to be the case. But in a data center, if I had the physical box connected to the same SAN that the virtual machine manager was connected to, and all of the drives were LUNs on that SAN, virtual machine manager could actually migrate the LUNs, what we call SAN transfer, instead of actually go through and do all of the physical copy. At this point, it asks me, where do I want to place that virtual machine that I'm converting? And you can actually set a path, and then you can set this as the default path for that host. In this case, I'm just putting it on the C drive of the virtual machine host. And at this point, I can configure things. Do I want to run this virtual machine under a specific account? Do I want to change the normal action that happens when the virtual machine stops? And do I want to use hardware-assisted virtualization? So who understands hardware-assisted virtualization? So a few of you do, so I wanted to make sure. In Virtual Server 2005, R2, SP1, I really hate saying that whole thing. In Virtual Server SP1, we've added the ability to support the Intel and AMD chip hardware virtualization technology that they have implemented. Intel calls theirs Intel VT, AMD calls theirs, it used to be AMD V, I just think it's called AMD virtualization now. This is enhancements to the processors that offload some capabilities of managing virtualization into the processor. Most of it's just processor related, context switching, things like that. If you have that technology in the server, and I highly recommend you buy servers, I don't even know if you can buy servers anymore without the technology, but it may not be enabled by default. Intel typically doesn't enable it by default. AMD, on their servers, I believe they do. It depends on the OEM that's using it. If you enable that technology on the host, then that provides me some additional offloading features. It'll do some performance improvement on the virtual server machine, especially during boot phase, building of virtual machines, loading of virtual machines, everything in which you would do before the virtual machine additions got installed on the virtual machine. It will really help. So if the server you're deploying to has that capability, you can enable it so that the virtual machine uses that when it gets deployed. This is a per virtual machine setting as I deploy a virtual machine to virtual server, so I can enable it for some and not enable it for others. But the host has to support the technology to begin with before you could actually use it. At this point, it gives me a roll-up, and all I have to do is say to go off and create. What it's going to do is it's going to start a job. Everything in Virtual Machine Manager is PowerShell in the background. So it's basically created a script, a PowerShell script to go off and do all of these actions. That's communicating with the VMM host, communicating with the remote virtual server, and then communicating with the actual physical box through the Windows Management Interface. So it's actually running right now. You can see down here at the bottom how it's actually going through the process. It's the overall conversion. It collected the machine configuration. It added the source machine to the managed pool. It created the virtual machine that it's actually going to move the disks to on the new host. And then now it's in the process of copying the hard drives. We're going to let that go, and we'll come back to it when I come to the next demo. So let's go on to go back to the slides. So assume I've done that P2V migration, and I've done it for that virtual machine or that physical host and whatever other physical hosts that are in that remote branch office. Now I want to make sure that I'm establish my backup capability. We talked a little bit about the fact that with Data Protection Manager, I build a Data Protection Manager in the host, and I've deployed the agents out there, I've deployed the agents out to the branch office virtual machine host, and now I want to back that up. Data Protection Manager has native support for virtual server, and it, once again, uses the VSS technology. So that's why your virtual server host needs to be Windows Server 2003 so that we have access to the VSS capability, because a lot of our tools make use of that. In addition, virtual server itself is only supported on Windows Server 2003. So once I have that configured, I actually put the agent on the host machine. By putting the agent in the host, I can actually back up the host and back up all the virtual machines that are running on that box. And the way that happens is all through VSS. So when I say I want to back up the host, I communicate to the host to say, I want to back you up. Please go do a snapshot. The host goes, oh, virtual server is running on this box, or the agent goes, virtual server is running on this box. I need to go talk to the virtual server service and the VSS provider that's available for virtual server, and I need to find out what virtual machines are running, and I need to tell it to go tell all of those virtual machines to basically quiesce their systems, flush everything to disk, and be prepared to be backed up. Everything, once all that's done, communicates back to the data center server. It says, hey, we're ready to back up. The agent sends the command to the agent goes, okay, let's back up. At that point, everything is quiesced from a virtual machine perspective. The host is ready. The host takes a snapshot and tells the virtual machines to take a snapshot at the same time. So the virtual machine takes a snapshot internal to the virtual machine so that any applications are properly backed up in there. And then the host takes a snapshot of the actual virtual machine files. And then all of that is sent back to the Data Protection Manager server. The first time I do that, I send everything. The next time I do that, I only send the changes that have happened since the first time I did the backup. So everything from the first going forward is all Delta technology. And it's on a byte basis. So I actually minimize the amount of traffic that goes across my WAN. So from a concern perspective of being able to back up today, if you're backing up across the WAN, or maybe you're not backing up across your WAN because it takes a lot of bandwidth, based on the backup technology you're using, DPM can really help you in that scenario to minimize the backup process. Once I've done my backup and I've established that everything is on there, everything is running, I've got a clean backup of everything, I want to make sure that I'm monitoring all that stuff so that I understand what the health of that server is. In order to make sure that I'm monitoring that, we have to make sure that the management pack is properly installed on the MOM 2007 server, or operations manager. I have to go in and say, do I want to modify any of the default rules that are there? Maybe I want to do something customized that's not out of the box. And then I want to start utilizing the reports that are existing in MOM. So MOM provides reports that gives me, MOM can actually be used to determine whether a server is a good virtualization candidate. It gives me a host utilization report that tells me what's the active utilization signature of this host. I can get the virtualization machine report from a utilization perspective. And then I can also get a trending report from a host standpoint that lets me know what's the utilization of this host and all the virtual machines on it been doing over time. So I can actually watch that. I can create rules that say, I want to define a set of thresholds that when that virtual machine host starts to get to a certain point of utilization, or there's a certain amount of network bandwidth or a certain amount of disk bandwidth disk space that's being used up on the host, I can actually throw alarms and do a whole bunch of different things. So in that process, you want to go off and do that. Once you get that done, you've installed that management pack over there. I forgot to click on that. Now you've got a system. You've got your virtual machine out there. You're backing it up. You're monitoring it. Now you need to manage it. A couple of approaches to do that. When Virtual Machine Manager does that deployment of virtual server on that virtual host out there in the branch, it does not install the web interface that Virtual Server comes with by default to manage it. The assumption is that if I'm using VMM to deploy that box, I'm going to manage it with VMM. Depending on how your management structure is based, you may have a single team that's managing all of the hosts and therefore all the virtual machines on the hosts, or you may want to provide the ability for a local admin or a geographically based administrator to support that branch office. Since there's no administrative console on that server, you need to provide them with a console in order to be able to get in and manage that box. And one of the ways to do that is, other than you writing your own with the COM API and Virtual Server, is to use Virtual Machine Manager and its self-service portal functionality. How many of you have heard about or used the self-service portal functionality for Virtual Machine Manager? Okay, just a few. So the portal is basically a web site that's available to to anyone that you assign to a set of policies. The way you build this infrastructure for a portal, you install the service, typically install that in the data center. You go off and create a host group, and you put the host that you want to manage in the host group. As soon as I put the host in that host group, I can go create a policy that defines who can manage that host group from a self-service portal perspective and what they can do. And what they can do can be things like deploy machines, manage machines, turn them off, restart them, all that kind of stuff. We'll show you that in the demo. You see the UI and what you can do. Once you build those policies, then you have to assign the policies to the virtual machines. You can build policies in two ways. You can build a policy that says only the owner or the person who created the virtual machine can manage that virtual machine. Or you can say, I want to create a shared policy that multiple people can manage that host and the virtual machines that are on it. Policy management is based on host. If I give someone the right to manage, I create the policy at the host group level, any host in that host group and all of the virtual machines on that host are managed by that policy. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so you can see that the migration is done. So the hard drive was copied. Everything was deployed via bits or the across the network transfer technology that we have. It went off and modified any settings to the operating system. So it goes off and looks at the virtual machine and it goes, do I need to change the HAL because maybe it was on a certain type of hardware and the HAL's different than what the virtual machine is. The network card needs to change, whatever needs to be changed, it'll go off and make those modifications, and then it'll remove the source machine out of the management pool because it doesn't need it anymore, and then it'll remove the files that it deployed to the virtual machine to go make the changes. So anyway, so that job is completed. If we go off and look at the host, and we go look at the virtual machines, now there's that box is now a virtual machine over there on that host. If I want to, I can go down here and click start. I can start the virtual machine. We can do that. Let it be cranking up. So let's look at from self-service portal. So when I install Virtual Machine Manager on my demo box here, I actually installed the self-service portal at the same time. So we're not going to go through the installation of it. If we go through the process, I built this host group called Branch Office Servers. So you can do this and however you want to do it. You can say, I want to create a host group for a single location and put one host in there. Or I can say, I want to create a group because I have a set of administrators that manage all my branch offices, and I want to put all of those hosts in there. However you want to set up the policies or the host groups in order to apply the policies to it, you can do that. So in this scenario, I created one called branch office servers, and I'm gonna take this host, and I'm gonna drag and drop it into that host group. So that basically moves it from the all hosts folder, which it goes by default when I add it, and I've put it into that branch office servers host group. I've already built a policy that's sitting out there. And this policy, I'll show you this one and then I'll build another one. So this policy basically has a name. The policy, I just called it branch office admins. I can assign a user or a group that this policy affects. So in this scenario, I have a test user called self-test. That user is the one that the policy affects, so I can affect a user or I can affect a group of users. And this, I picked just a user account. I could use either in this scenario. I picked what's the host group that I'm affecting by this policy, and what's the ownership of the virtual machine. So what did I select? I can control whether or not anyone in the policy can create virtual machines and how they can do that, which we'll go through. I can control what kind of management functionality they have. So, do they have everything, or do they have just a subset of the capabilities? So if I wanted to, I could give someone the ability to remotely manage a box, but they can't stop it, they can't restart it, they can't shut it down. I can be reasonably granular in what I can do. And then I can say, let's say I have a virtual machine out there and I want to actually, for some reason, you typically wouldn't want to do this in a branch, but in a test and dev environment, I might want to take that virtual machine and store it back into the library for some reason. This is where I can say what libraries are valid for me to be able to do that. So let's go actually, I guess I could have just stayed in there. Let's go add a new policy just to show you the wizard here. So let's give it a policy called test branch. Oops, spelled right. I can go pick a user or group. So I actually have a group that I created for a set of users, and I have the individual user. So let's pick the group. And then I can say, how do I want the ownership of the virtual machines? When the virtual machines are created, or if I go and modify the ownership value, how do I want that controlled from a policy perspective? Do I want a per user policy to be established, or do I want it based on shared ownership? So we'll do per user. And this is where it asks me is, do I want to allow anyone affected by this policy to be able to create virtual machines? So from a branch office perspective, what you have to consider here is where the library is that you're going to be using to actually do the deployment. If my library server where everything is setting is in the data center, and I give people the ability to create virtual machines, they're going to be creating the virtual machine from a template that's sitting in the data center. You probably don't want to do that if you've got a 3 or 4 gigabyte template sitting in the data center. What you can do, though, is you can actually deploy, when you build a virtual machine host, you can actually establish a library share on that host and then copy the appropriate templates to that share and then use that share as the deployment point. So the best case is I now have the library share in the branch, I have my templates in the branch, and if I need to deploy a virtual machine, so I'm deploying a new service, or maybe I'm rebuilding a service that crashed and I've decided I want to actually do it in the redeployment instead of from a recovery perspective for some reason, then I can actually do that from the branch. But you need to be careful when you enable this capability that you have that library set up in the branch. If you don't have that library set up, then you can actually do major impact to your WAN. So let's look at from a virtual machine management perspective. How many people have local administrators in their branch offices? Okay, so very few. So most everyone manage their branch offices from the central location. So in that scenario, you might just want to give full control, but it depends on what your policies are. Do you, if you have a breakdown based on specific types of roles, do you have just domain administrators? Then you have exchange administrators, and it depends on how your roles are. So let's assume I'm going to be able to start and stop, and I'm going to be able to get remote access to this box. And from a branch perspective, typically you would not want to enable this functionality. You typically are not going to want to take a virtual machine that's deployed in production and move that into the library. So you would typically say next on this one. So this basically tells you what the configuration is of this policy, and I'm going to tell it to go create the policy. It'll build the policy, assign it to this host group, and make it available. So then I can go back in and I can look at the properties of that policy like we did before. Okay, now that I have that policy built, I now need to have that policy affect what's out there in the branch. If I have a policy built and I create a new virtual machine on a host that's managed by a policy, and I do that, say, through the self-service portal, then it will automatically go assign certain capabilities. It will assign the policy to that virtual machine. It'll make sure from an ownership perspective that everything is created properly. In my scenario here, where I've actually gone and I've done the virtual migration of the virtual machine, it's sitting out there on that physical host, and then I've built a policy. That virtual machine right now, by default, is not affected by that policy, and I have to go modify that. So I can go look at the physical machine. As you can see, here's the one I did with the virtual server that was running in the Viridian virtual machine technology. So I'm going to go off and I'm going to look at the properties of this virtual machine. To set the owner, I go to this page and I set the owner. So in this perspective, I've already set that when I did the P2V migration. I don't need to set that now. And then under the self-service tab, I select what the self-service policy is. So I can only have a single policy affecting a virtual machine at a time. So if I want to go off and say, I want the test branch policy to be in effect, I can establish that for this virtual machine. So if I want to create a policy for a specific group of administrators and apply that to a specific set of virtual machines, I can go off and do that. So when I say save, it actually goes off and applies that policy to the virtual machine and tells the agent on that virtual host now that policy applies to it. So let's go and let's go to the self-service portal. So as an administrator, if I go to the self-service portal, it's actually going to give me an administrative view of the portal. So as an administrator, I really can't use the self-service portal. I have to have a different user account to go off and use the self-service portal. Because as the administrator, the assumption is I want to be able to go assist other users of the portal. So when I want to go do that, I can actually go in here and say, I want to go assist another user, and I want to see what the problems they're having, and I want to go in and provide their username, and I want to go see in troubleshooting mode what they see. Oops, I can't spell. I think someone said that, but so this is what the end user would see in the self-service portal. Oops, I have that's okay. The virtual machine it brought up since I set the other policy is it's looking at the other server that is on the host itself that's not running right now. So this is what the end user would see. It would actually just say welcome Contoso/self-test. It would provide this interface to them. If the virtual machine was running, it would actually give them a thumbnail view of the virtual machine. They can click on the virtual machine. It would actually bring up on the right-hand side the ActiveX control with the VMRC. They can interactively log into the box, manage the box. If I had the ability to go off and build virtual machines, from a library perspective, it would show me what virtual machines are in the library, and it would also show me what templates are available for me to actually go off and deploy. So anyway, that's basically the process you go through from a self-service portal perspective to get it up and running, assign the policies, assign those policies to the virtual machine, and then at this point it's basically a web interface I can get to from anywhere inside my infrastructure to manage that information. So let's flip back to the deck. So what do I need to do in order to set up the provisioning aspect? So we talked about you have to create templates. What is a template? A template is a virtual machine configuration and a virtual hard disk that defines a virtual machine that you want to deploy. A template has operating system installed on it. It needs to be sys-prepped. You typically want to have the additions already installed on the box. You want to have all the patches installed. You build the template, you put it into the library, and at this point I can build and provision a virtual machine by simply going in and saying, I want to create a new virtual machine, and I want to build it based on that template. And the process is the copying of that template to whatever host from the library, and that library could be the data center library or the local library, and then it actually gets deployed. Once it's deployed, I can boot it, I can go off and manage it, automatically gets added into the infrastructure. All of the agents get deployed on there to be able to manage it. Once I've gone off and, like we talked about, build the local library from a branch office perspective, you want that local library out there, and then you want to go modify your policies in order to control who you want and don't want to be able to build virtual machines. You might want someone to be able to manage the branch office but not build virtual machines, but you might want a certain set of administrators to be able to do that, and you want to build the policies in order to allow that functionality. So what about kind of an advanced view? So we talked about deploying a single host. What if my host or my branch office is a bigger branch office? And what if I'm in that situation where I want to ensure I've now built a single host where I have maybe I have 3 or 4 virtual machines on there, maybe more, and I want to actually provide more high availability in that scenario. I can actually change or upgrade that environment to what we call a host clustered environment. So I will actually deploy another host to that environment, and then I can cluster those two hosts together. This will give me high availability in that branch, so that if the loss of a single host won't take the branch down. So in that scenario, you're using Microsoft clustering services, and you can do it in a pretty simple way with the back-end iSCSI and just use a local disk resource. So you don't have to deploy this large, expensive SAN infrastructure to make this happen. Everything can be based on iSCSI. In doing this, though, you get the ability of having if any host fails, it'll automatically migrate that virtual machine to the other node and restart it. Or I can manually do that and then perform maintenance on one of the hosts. So that the advantage of that situation is I now can obtain higher availability for that branch office, especially if I don't have any local resources, or getting there is not a short time duration in order to go do troubleshooting or recovery perspective. It's an easier way to go and accomplish that, and it doesn't increase the cost tremendously, because now if I actually add another host, I can actually split the load across those two hosts, or if I needed to provide more services, I can utilize both boxes. So even though we're not really talking about the data center from the perspective, I can extend everything that we did in the branch office. I can extend that to the data center. I can do the host clustering in the data center. I can manage everything with the same tools. So that's the benefit. If I build this infrastructure, I can utilize it in all my branches and in the data center. I don't have to deploy multiple information or resources. So what are the resources that are out there to help me? So we talked about the branch office infrastructure solution. Once again, that's all about optimizing the services that I want, and it really has nothing to do with the virtualization of those services. If we're talking about virtualization, there's Microsoft Press, the Virtual Server 2005 R2 Resource Kit. This gives you guidance on what virtualization is, how to install it, how to manage it, how to script access, manage automation. It provides chapters about Virtual Machine Manager, provides a step-by-step, the guidance that's at the appendix in this deck is a short version of 6 chapters in the book about what to go through in a step-by-step procedural process for actually doing a virtualization project. There's also a bunch of tech centers out there which have information on all the products that we've talked about. And then there's a new white paper if you've investigated host clustering prior to Virtual Machine Manager deploying. There's a new white paper that's just been released with an updated version of the script for host clustering that allows it to integrate better with Virtual Machine Manager. So if you're going to deploy Virtual Machine Manager and you want to do host clustering to provide high availability to your virtual machines, you want to go get this white paper and get the updated script in order to provide that interface. Just to let you know, today, the book of the day is supposed to be the resource kit, so you can get it at a discount at the bookstore. So let's open it up for Q&A, but while we're doing that, I talked about doing a little giveaway from a perspective. So I'm actually going to give away copies of the book if you're interested in that. And what I did about a couple of hours ago is I came in here and there's 2 chairs on this side and there's 2 chairs on that side, which if you reach under the front, I taped a little sticky that has just like the name of the session listed on it. If you don't find it, you might want to check the one next to you to see if you can find, we found one over here. We found one over here, so that's 2. There's 3. And I know there's one further back there. So start looking. So anyway, do you have any questions? If you do, about the session, there's 2 mics on the end, so it'd be easier to hear your questions. It'd be good. Like always, please fill out your evaluations. Let me know if you've won the giveaway on the book. Come up after the session, and I have it back here. I'll give it to you. So questions? There was a hand that was raised over here, I think.
So your hardware is hardware enabled, so to say.
Right. If you're saying you're migrating a virtual machine from a host that is hardware enabled to a host that's not hardware enabled, yes, it will affect your virtual machine. I'm trying to think. Does VM? And you're assuming you're using VMM to do the migration? Okay. I don't believe there's a setting that actually pops up for that. If the machine is migrated and it's hard coded in the VMC file to use hardware assisted virtualization, what it will do is the virtual machine won't start, and it will give you an error back in the UI that says you just need to go to disable that, and then it'll start. So, okay, there's a person back on the mic.
Hello. I was just interested to know if you can run Virtual Machine Manager and Operations Manager on virtual machines, or is there any issues with that?
I do not believe Virtual Machine Manager is supported in a virtual machine. Does it work? Yes, I've shown that. But I don't believe it's supported. Just to be sure, I remember seeing in the release notes that they made a note in there saying it wasn't supported. But just to be sure, the program managers are at the booth in the exhibit hall. You might post the question to them to see if they changed the policy.
And is that the same for Operations
For
Manager?
Operations Manager, as far as I know, Operations Manager is supported inside a virtual machine.
Okay, thanks for that.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
The virtual server 2005 hardware is still supporting only one processor pad.
Right. So the question is Virtual Server 2005 R2 SP1 still support a single processor inside a virtual machine? Yes, we did not change for SP1. We didn't make that change, but in Hyper-V, which is the next, we actually support up to 4 processors inside a virtual machine. So right now, for anyone who has the RC0 version of Windows 2008, and they have the CTP version of Hyper-V, you can do multiple processors with Windows 2008, but you can't with Windows 2003. So it's just they hadn't added that to the code yet before they released it. So if you want to do that, then you'll have to wait until the beta, which will come out when Windows 2008 RTMs. There'll be a beta coming out of Hyper-V, and at that point, I believe all the features should be there, and then we're just like making performance enhancements and stuff like that. So, yes. So the question is, if I have a branch that doesn't have the networking bandwidth in order to do a P2V migration, and are you saying inside the branch, or are you saying across the WAN? Okay. When you do a migration, if the physical box is in the branch and the host that I'm trying to migrate to is in the branch, if it's in the data center, you don't want to do that. You want to move. Are you trying to move the box from the branch to the data center? Then your best bet is to put the host, since the host is going to be more portable, put the host in the branch, do the migration, and then bring it to the data center, or depending on what kind of hardware you have available, you could do a DR backup of the branch, restore it in the data center on the same hardware, and then do the migration. But there is no way to do a migration to like a temporary format in the branch and then move that to the data center and then finish the migration. Not with Virtual Machine Manager. There is third-party tools that have that functionality, but then you have the same problem. You still have to deploy a box to the branch to get it to the intermediate.
So the best case in that case is to restore that box of the branch in the data center and then do the migration.
Your issues with that approach is what's the delta difference between the branch and your backup. That's a hard problem to solve unless you either put the host in the branch, do the migration, say, I'm now going to move that service to the data center and move the whole thing, or you say, I'm moving the service to the data center, so I'm going to move that box to the data center and then virtualize it. There's not much we can do about solving. I understand. There's not much we can do about solving that issue with the performance of the WAN. So, are there any other questions over here?
What is about the security risks when you use hardware-based virtualization support regarding rootkits like Blue Pill? Because from a security perspective, I would say the only thing you can do against it is to turn it off.
I have my opinions about that.
I would be very interested in.
Yeah, the rootkit stuff has been debunked, and then now they've come back and said, no, we figured out another way around it. Most of the issues there are typically driven by an administrator has done something wrong. So I've been on the box, and I've done something on the box in order to get the rootkit there. So I've surfed the web, I've done something I typically shouldn't have done. If you haven't done those things on the box, your risk level is pretty low. So I don't see why the benefits you get from the host hardware virtualization is higher than the risk if you're managing your environment correctly. If the risk is high because of the way you manage your environment, then turn it off if you feel the risk is that high. The reality is, in the future, you don't have a choice. You have to have it on, because almost everyone's new hypervisor that's coming out is going to require that technology. So from a future perspective, it's probably better to deal with the issues that get you to that risk right now than to bet on I'm not going to be able to have that on, because you're going to have it on. So that's the way I would deal with it. So. Okay, the session's over. If you have any more questions, be happy to talk here or outside. For those who got the sticker for the book, please come see me. I'll give you the book.